Hello, y'all. I'm Ellie. This is Dyslexia Talks. Today we're talking about reading, and our experiences with reading as dyslexics. I'm here with my co-host, Rick, and we're going to dive in more.
Hey Ellie, I'm excited about
Hello.
how our dyslexia talks is shaping up, and I'm super excited to
Me
talk about
too.
reading. Do you have any what are your thoughts on reading? I've been since last week when we did our writing episode, which I think we could do like 10 more episodes on each one of these topics. Um, but do you have any what are your thoughts since last week on reading? Because I've definitely I've been thinking about some experiences that I hadn't thought about in a long time around reading.
Yeah, I've definitely been thinking about my childhood experiences around reading. I think a lot like writing, a lot of it was me being really frustrated with how arbitrary
Hmm.
the rules seemed. And what was told to me that was important and
Hmm.
what people said was important in the process of learning to read. Um, so yeah, that's really my like main.
Do you have one example of the rules and the frustrations? Or do you have an
Yeah,
earliest memory?
I mean, I think there was so where how I learned to read was a lot like how you learn a second language. I learned through like memorizing phonemes and really breaking the language down to its basic components, you know. And so a lot of what I experienced was um just getting so frustrated with the repetition of these different sounds when I couldn't see the bigger picture and it didn't seem significant at all. And none of this was related to
Mm-hmm.
storytelling that was important to me. So it just felt so mundane, you know.
Did it feel rigid too? Like you couldn't break free from that rigidity to figure it out?
Oh yeah, extremely
You know?
rigid. It was really frustrating. And I think ever since I was little, I've been a storyteller. Like my mom talks about how she used to dictate these like crazy stories that I would tell her.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's how I read. I saw it as a way to like hear other people's stories and read books that interested me.
Yeah.
And that's what I grew up experiencing reading as because my parents read to me a lot. So then to go to this after that was to go to like
Oh
that super
yeah.
mundane position was super frustrating. Yeah.
And it was really prescriptive, right?
Yeah,
Like
really
that's interesting. So do you remember when you first felt comfortable reading on your own, where you didn't have to worry about the rules and the regulations of the way they were teaching you how to read in school? Well, do you remember at all when you?
it took a long time. It was probably around 5th grade or 6th grade. And like the crazy thing is like of course as soon as it became like not as prescriptive and a little bit more natural, like I became
Hmm.
such a bookworm and I would read so much
Hmm.
because I love stories. But before then, before I didn't really have the tools, it just felt brutal. Yeah.
Yeah. I have,
Yeah. I don't know what
I've been dabbling with teaching myself Italian, and I'm running into the same problem you're describing, learning how to read when you were young, right? And all the ways they teach Italian are prescriptive and
mhm.
based on a way that standardized or normal, typical brain wiring people learn. And I realize the only way I'm going to learn Italian is if I memorize it, which is
Yep.
part of me is like, I don't know if I'm willing to do that. I think I could probably memorize it and figure it out if I lived there, but I can't do it through the books because it's like, oh, here, conjugate these verbs. Okay, that makes sense to me. I know, I figure out, yeah, you can learn how to conjugate verbs, but what happens is I can do it on paper, but when I go to do it in real life, like in Italy, I can't pull it up. It's like I've built a when I write it or I see it, because we've wired our
Yeah.
brains differently, I'm capable of reading it and conjugating verbs on paper. But when I go to do it or go to write it on my own, it's like a different pathway. So I have to go do it a different way. It's almost like to learn Italian two different ways: how to do it in reading and writing, and how to do it in real life. Or for me, how I would actually need to use it in real life. So I totally get that experience because I'm reliving it as a 51-year-old.
I did as a 21-year-old when I went to Spain. So, because I
Mm-hmm.
spent 6 years learning Spanish and it was
Mm-hmm.
incredibly frustrating. I was
Mm-hmm.
not good in Spanish class. I couldn't retain much. I conjugations just confused me so much, especially when they expected you to conjugate something in context, like understand the context and
Mm-hmm.
then know how to
Mm-hmm.
conjugate it. I was just lost, of course. Um,
Yeah.
and then got to Spain, it felt like I didn't know how to speak Spanish. Like the speaking part of my brain is completely different than the reading part of my brain.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that adds up. Like I know I had a really big vocabulary as a kid, but like don't ask me to write any of those words or read.
Whatever
Um,
you do, don't have me write it down.
no, please, yeah. So, um, but
That
yeah. So
that
then,
describe that is the essence of our problem, Ellie, with school, right? We understand
yeah,
it, but when asked to transcribe it onto paper for people, that's where the system breaks down.
yeah, yeah. And then you just feel incredibly frustrated because you know you're smart, but you feel like you can't prove
Yep.
it in the way that people expect you
Yeah.
to prove it. Yeah, yeah.
I think it's crazy that the only proof in writing, um,
Hmm.
it or reading it or being able to just show by writing it that you read it, right? Like there's all this crazy systems around reading and writing that don't make any sense to a dyslexic, right? Because you're like, I understand the concepts, but why do I have to prove it through my writing? This might be the
Yeah.
perfect time to talk about the Mesopotamians. So I like to blame somebody for all this, and theoretically right now it's the Mesopotamians because in the West they invented writing. And I think what's interesting about that is it totally connects to your ability to tell stories, right? Because when writing was invented 5,000 years ago by the Mesopotamians, or the current version of writing, right? Like um, the Egyptians had it too, but it was so um, visually based that what was interesting about that was that it didn't really survive. Hieroglyphics can't survive because it's all based on memorization. And if you invent new characters, you have to just keep memorizing more stuff, and you're not capable of doing it. But anyhow,
Yep.
the Mesopotamians, when they invented writing, three things happened. People started writing down accounts, so accounting was invented immediately. So it's how much grain is in this bin over here. There's this much grain in this bin, so accounting. Then rules,
Yeah.
were
Hmm.
invented, right? Laws were invented. But then, thirdly, fiction, story, right? Like
Yeah.
superheroes were
Yeah.
invented. And I think that what's interesting is that in our school system, you're not allowed to focus on story until college. If that,
Hmm.
if that, if that, right? Like it's interesting that in our educational system, we leave out the part that is fantasy based, that's fiction based, that you're allowed to move through space however you want. Because Gilgamesh was the first epic story written down, and it's crazy. It's a crazy story. Like it's like overwhelming. It's like crazy, right? Like he has a sidekick named Kindu. It's like Batman and Robin kind of stuff. So I think it's interesting that right when was invented, these three things happened. But what
Hmm.
is the predominant way of using writing in our culture is in school is legal system rules, and here's the rules, and here's the accounts. So we're being
Yeah.
subjugated by accounts and rules. And one of my favorite things about the early laws in Mesopotamia, and if we want to show the law code of Hammurabi, it's awesome. It's like I think it has over 250 laws on it, Ellie. And all the
Hmm.
laws, not all of them, I'm exaggerating, but most of the laws are about like if you do something bad, you get thrown in the river. And if you drowned, that means you were like, that you weren't guilty. Or there was one law that says if you poke your neighbor's eye out, you're going to have your eye poked out. It's all that kind of stuff. It's like you could tell by reading the laws that the Hammurabi is trying to create some kind of order. Like,
Hmm.
if you do something bad to somebody, then something bad is going to happen to you. And so you could,
Hmm.
but I think it's funny that laws became important as a tool in writing. So I just
Hmm.
think that that's really interesting that that's still the case today. We have accounts, we have rules, and we have fiction and story.
Hmm.
And yet story is seen as lesser than.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think a
Yeah.
lot of our society sees creative pursuits that don't fit in the confines of some sort of set of rules as,
Yep.
lesser than or like a way out, sort of like visual arts
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
creative writing. or anything creative. And yeah, I think especially as a dyslexic, you keep butting up against all these rules, and
Yeah.
you just feel incredibly frustrated because, I
Yep.
mean, our brains don't really work within those rules, and it
Yeah.
becomes increasingly obvious as you move through school because you just keep running into them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, why?
Well, at the,
I don't understand.
well, you know what's funny? I didn't tell you this story in our last episode, but it makes more sense in this episode around reading. But it's a writing story. Guess what I did? How I got one of my coping mechanisms was when asked to do a writing assignment that was
Mhm.
kind of like an assignment, right? It was boring. You just had to like regurgitate some information for the professor or the teacher. And I hated that, right? Because I couldn't do it, number one. And number two, I thought was stupid, right? Like, why would I regurgitate what I just read in this
Yeah.
textbooks for you? So I
Mhm.
wrote a story in my junior year in high school. Instead of writing what the teacher wanted, I wrote a fictitious story about G.I. Joe and Snake Man. And it was kind of like Gilgamesh. I wrote this crazy story that related to the text, to what we were supposed
Yeah.
to read in the textbook. And the teacher, he read it and he was like, I don't know how I can't give you an A for this, but it's not what I asked for you to do. So,
Yeah.
and that, that only worked every once in a while because this is in California, and in California, your junior year, you had to take these exams to graduate. You had to take a reading exam, a writing exam, a math exam, and
Mm.
I went to take the writing exam, and you had to write a story about a person in your life who made a big difference in your life, like a relative or somebody who made a big impact in your life. And I was like, yeah, this is another stupid question that you have to write about. So I invented a whole story about Charlie the tuna from the tuna company. And that one didn't work. I didn't pass. They wouldn't allow me to
No.
write fiction, but I felt like fiction was the place where I could at least get show that my idea, I understood the idea. I understood what the gist of everything, but I could only explain it to them in fiction. But it doesn't fly for most people because they want the account. They want the record, this accurate record in writing. But
Mhm.
so one of the things I've had a problem with, I don't know if you've had this problem with reading, is that when it comes to accounts and it comes to laws, that seems so weird to me that people spend so much time on trying to figure out the accuracy of those things when it's obvious that over time those things change constantly. So why would we spend all of our time so hyperly focused on the rules when the rules are always being changed by cultures? So that's why I think
Yeah.
another reason why I prefer the fiction, because that seems to be a stable platform that's interesting.
Yeah,
Like I feel like the
completely outside.
fiction's more stable. The story's more stable than the because the grain in the elevator is going to constantly change, and you're constantly going
Yeah.
to have to write down that record. That just seems really
Yep.
mundane. That seems really mundane and not useful. I mean, I know it's useful in economies and
Mhm.
in commerce, but for me,
Mhm.
I just was repulsed by it.
That's
Okay, one
interesting
more. I
because,
want to loop back. Yeah, go ahead.
well, I was just
Go
gonna
ahead.
say I walked away from college feeling, I guess repulsed would be the word, like, to describe exactly how I felt, right? Like, felt like we were learning real, like, it was all these, like, scholars putting names and systematizing just natural things that happen on Earth, right? Or to humans. And, like,
Mm-hmm.
the movement of human beings, like, how immigration works, or, like, how people react to climate change, and it was, like, labeling it with these labels and then not testing us on what was actually happening in the world, but testing us on how well we knew the labels for what was happening in the world, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it just felt so incredibly arbitrary. And like, why are you making these
Yes.
rules? These things, events that just happen in the world, like climate change or immigration,
Mm-hmm.
or like war, right? And so, yeah, I walked away feeling just repulsed. It just felt really like stodgy and like,
Yeah.
just really claustrophobic, honestly. Yeah,
No,
like
it
too many
is.
layers.
It is. And but what I think is fascinating is the people who are good at that can track with that information for a long time. So I'll give you an example. Like when I was chair of the art and design department at my school, I'd have to go to these meetings where all this paperwork. write records, all this paperwork would be presented for a change in the curriculum. And I couldn't for the life of me ever track where we were. There'd be like 60 pages, right, of information. And I thought I'd be on the right page. And like my dean would look over and be like, no, we're on page 52. And I was on page 18, right? Like where are we? I don't know where we
Yeah.
are. This doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
I could never track with it because it didn't make sense to me because it was mundane. All seemed kind of mundane. It wasn't the concepts that were important. It was all these details and these,
Mhm.
like, and then everybody was organizing their writing differently. So that was also hard for me to track with, right? Like everybody had a different hierarchical system of what was important to them. And everybody else seemed to be able to track with it. And I couldn't track with it. And it was frustrating, but also seemed ridiculous because people weren't expressing the high level ideas. They were getting criticized on changes to the curriculum based on the details, these mundane
Mhm.
details that they all could agree on. And I was like,
Mhm.
wait, our students are suffering because we're over here dinking around with some details that may or may not matter to them in the
Mhm.
live classroom, but matters to somebody who cares about what's on paper.
Yeah.
I would just
Yeah.
find myself infinitely frustrated.
Yeah, just getting bogged down in the details that just don't seem so
Yeah.
insignificant. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the thing. They didn't, it doesn't, that's, and I feel like this is another episode, but that's something that perpetually happens to me. I see the big picture, I see what's important, and then I kind of go,
Mhm.
wait a minute, why are we doing all this busy work that doesn't
Yeah.
benefit anybody? And that's where
Mhm.
I get in trouble because the people really, a lot of people value that busy work because they see the record as being really important going forward.
Mhm. And,
And
like,
so I
in
think
some ways
it is, no,
but
it is important.
it also gets in the way of people certain brain types like ours.
Yeah, exactly. So
Then.
I
Yeah.
just suffer, I just suffer through those sorts of things. Um,
Yeah.
well, looking back to reading when we were young, I want to know more about how reading has made a big impact on you. And before we do that, I just wanted to share with you how I actually didn't really read until junior high, Ellie. Like that's what I wanted to
Really.
tell you. I didn't really read well because I wasn't labeled a dyslexic and put into remedial reading or some other place where I could figure it out. I just had to figure it out. And I think it's only by the
Mhm.
grace of my grandmother who um, she did what your parents did, which was she provided interesting books to me that I thought would be interesting.
Mhm.
Like the classics, like Treasure Island and stuff like that, right? Um, and she really loved reading, and she really loved the classics. So she just kept coming at me until a book took, and then she would ask me about it. And
Yeah.
I think that's the only
Yeah.
reason that I'm a voracious reader now is because my grandmother um, noticed that I wasn't reading and that I needed to read and that something was off. We didn't have any language for it at the time. Um,
Mhm.
and then she just kept finding, and she did it in like kind of a loving way where it wasn't punitive. It's just she kept trying to find something that I would find interesting because
Yeah.
I was an adventurous type, right? I still
Mhm.
am. So she just tried to find books, and eventually she found some, and then would ask me questions about it. And
Yeah.
I mean, I was a pretty slow reader, and I think that was the frustrating part too, right? It's slow. It comes slow. It's like learning a new language right now. It's really slow. It's arduous. It's going to take a long time. Um,
Work.
but I'm super
Work.
grateful for my grandmother for that because ever since then, now it didn't take for a while. Then the second part of the story was I didn't really start to engage reading in a really powerful way till college, and you're going to love this. So my freshman year in college, I realized I just intuitively realized this was going to be a nightmare. And so the only way I could cope with the assignments was by not doing them and going to the library and finding books that I liked. So I would go to the library and search for something, and then I would just read. And what would happen would be I wouldn't do the homework right, but I'd be like, yeah, I read this really cool book about that topic to the professor. And they'd be like, oh,
Mhm.
wait a minute, why is he? I was the only one in class reading about the topic from a different perspective. And that was the only
Yeah.
way I got through college was to show that I was reading about the subject matter we were talking about, but I was never doing the homework. I was never doing the assignments correctly. I would just get around it and the irony is I was doing it by reading. So
Yeah.
I got around a lot of the busy work in college by just showing that I was well read on the topic, which I think
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
super ironic, right? Being
That's
dyslexic, but it was my
that's
workaround. And it still is my workaround. I just
That's
thought you get a kick
yeah,
out of that. So, but reading has
that's
become really powerful to me. But I wanted
yeah,
to hear from you, like how it. I mean, I know that story is really powerful to you, but do you have any experiences like that where you've had to use your dyslexic skills? I know we talked a little bit about like communicating and seeing the big picture and
yeah.
asking for help and
I well, I think one thing that is different between our two experiences, like I was lucky enough to become pretty proficient in my reading skills by the time I was in like high school, probably around sophomore year of
yeah.
high school. I got pretty good at reading. So I never had to really kind of work around it in the way
Mm,
that I think you had to. But I do
yeah.
think I am an incredibly slow reader, and a lot of my classes would be like, I don't know, 60 pages of reading before each class, you know. Um,
Yeah. That's a
and
lot.
I realized it was just completely unfeasible for me because I am still a slow reader, right? Um, and so I think one thing that I got really good at doing was like skimming, but I can't skim like the way I think normal readers skim. Like people are just like, "Oh, I
I know,
read it
right?
really fast." And I'm like, I don't understand what you're
Yeah.
saying. Like I don't, right? So, I think I got a really good at sort of bullshitting and like being able to read one sentence, being what I thought it meant about the whole entire like
Yes.
paragraph or whatever. And my professors would be like, "Oh, wow, like nice job." But I would be like, "I just made that up." Um and then
Well, you extracted it from the sentence. You could see something happening.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I definitely got like confident in my skills of just
Hmm.
like extraction and honestly storytelling. Like it was still storytelling. It's
Yes.
just like about weird minute topics. And then yeah, I think I got really good at like um just understanding just from like like just developing a strategy for skimming that worked for me where
Hmm.
I would just read like the first
Hmm.
couple sentences of each paragraph. And it sounds so mundane, but it like saved me in college.
Hmm.
Um
Hmm.
yeah, but it was mainly just bullshitting.
Are
Got
you, do
really
you
good at
think of yourself, are you still a slow reader? Because I've become a fast reader. I've got a funny story about that. My grandmother, when I was in college, I lived with my grandmother, and
Mhm.
so since I was on a book quest, we were reading a lot of books, and um, I was at the time I was reading Stephen King's The Stand, and
Mhm.
she was disgusted by such things, but I read it and I was like, "Oh, Grandma, you got to read this." And Stephen King's The Stand is like this thick. It's
Yeah.
crazy thick, right? And I
Yeah.
was like, "Grandma, you got to read this. You got to read this." And so she read it, and she read it like super fast. Like it took me like 2 months to read it,
Mhm.
and she read it like in a couple matter of days. And I was like, my cousin, who's like 10 years older than me, I was saying to my cousin Mary, I'm like, Mary, how the hell did she do that? And like, and she's like, she not only read it and understood it, she told me it was crap. Like, this is a crappy book. Like, you shouldn't read stuff like this. But my cousin said, well, she's got 50 years of practice on you of reading. And then
Yeah.
it dawned on me that reading is a form of practice. You know,
Mhm.
you can
Mhm.
practice it even if you're dyslexic and get better at it.
Yeah.
Um, I could like I consume books now. I could read the 60 pages. I mean, I would if I didn't like it, I would do exactly if I didn't like it, I would do exactly what you would do. I'd read a paragraph and be like, okay, I got to figure it out. I would like read like a paragraph from the
That,
middle and be like, okay, I think I know what this is about.
that was the other issue. I didn't really care about what I was reading. I was just like, all
Yeah,
right, let's get through
yeah.
it.
But
Yeah.
I think that you can get better at it, and I've noticed I've gotten better at. But we all, as we both know, we're not actually reading. We're doing something else. So we're just getting better at whatever it is that we're doing. Um, and I think this is a perfect time to show that quote, right? Like that dyslexia is not a reading problem. It's not a reading and writing problem. It's something different. And I think that that's the thing. That's the problem with the stigma of being dyslexic is that people refer to it as being a reading writing problem when in fact it's not. And so I think this quote from Bruce and the Squid is awesome. And maybe I'll just read it. It says, like, a tangled tale begins as it should in our evolutionary past. Its backdrop is best captured by the British neuropsychologist Andrew Ellis. Thank you, Andrew Ellis, who declared that whatever dyslexia turns out to be, it is not a reading disorder. Ellis was referring to the fact that in terms of human evolution, the brain was never meant to read. Now, I'm not going to read the whole rest of the thing, but I want to read the last quote here where it says, dyslexia cannot be anything so simple as a flaw in the brain's reading center, for no such thing exists. This is another one of those passages, Ellie, that really helped me stop being self-conscious about being dyslexic and
Mhm.
reading and writing, because I was like, oh, wait a minute. Reading, like we talked about, reading's fiction. We made it up and we forced people's brains to figure it out, right? By connecting the
Mhm.
different centers of the brain, the visual and then the auditory and all these different areas, right, are getting
Mhm.
shaped to read, but that wasn't how the brain was designed. And so I
Yeah.
felt a ton of freedom when I read this quote.
Yeah. I like
Because
I
there's no reading
really
center. There's no reading center.
right, like the revelation of that was pretty big for me because like you grow up and
Mm-hmm.
through like the first 15 years of your life, like being good at reading is probably one of the most important things,
Yes,
skills that you can have. And you just feel like it's inherent to like you
yeah,
functioning in society, which yes, it is, but it is also reassuring to know that
yeah,
you are not built physically in like the structure of your brain to be able to read. Like
yeah,
that is an adaptation that humans made in order to survive in a more complex world, but it is not the only way
exactly.
you can adapt, you know? If there's one way, then
But
there's
what I
also other.
but what I think is crazy about reading and writing is it becomes a form of a prison that everybody I think, right? Like you have to conform. You have to do it
Yeah.
or else, right? You can't
Yeah.
or you can't succeed in society or participate in the culture. But that's
Yeah.
not true.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's the
No.
perception when you're younger, right? Oh, they're not reading. They're 3 years old. They're not reading yet. What's wrong? But that's because there's no
Yeah.
reading center.
Yeah. And our brain takes a hot sec to rewire itself and figure out what needs to connect where
Exactly.
in order to read. Like
Exactly.
those brain scans show, like it takes a while if your
Exactly.
brain is using crazy amount of like different hemispheres to read. It's gonna take a while to figure that out. Like
Yeah.
that is it's not just a
No, and I
part of being.
it's not. It's not natural. No wonder it's so hard for everybody. I mean, it's hard for everybody if you think about it.
Yeah.
Just some people have it less hard than others. It's still hard for a normal person who wires their brain in the quote unquote normal way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I know that we have to, this episode has to be a little bit shorter just because of time tonight, but one thing that I wanted to not leave out was the power of books on both of us. Like books and reading have been had a powerful influence on me. And I don't know what I'd do without it, even though it's a pain in the ass, right? Like, so one story I wanted to tell you that I don't think I've told you about is that like reading for me has a direct correlation to my artistic output and my creative life. So whenever I read, I bug everybody around me. Everybody's just like, they're like, oh no, here comes Rick. He read a new book and he's going to tell us about it. Right. Because I get these ideas when I read. I have these powerful experiences of insights and ideas and things I didn't know about. I get excited about it and I want to make them. And books do that for me. And one of the books that had the biggest impact on me when I was your age, well, close to your age, was I read Moby Dick, because nobody reads Moby
Mm-hmm.
Dick. They say they do, right? And I got to chapter 37. Chapter 37 is called Sunset. And I read this chapter, Ellie, and I was like, wait a minute, this chapter is why this is a classic. This chapter is why it's great literature. And it's interesting, right? My brain just like lit up when I saw it. Um, and I got
Mm-hmm.
super excited and I wanted to make a whole body of work about Moby Dick. And then I was in grad school at the time and I got shot. Guess what? I got shot down by a bunch of artists who don't read. They're like, well, we don't know what you're talking about. Like, that's weird that you want to make art about Moby Dick. We're not quite sure what that means because I never read it and I don't care about it. So I got railroaded by my professors who didn't read, but that's stuck in my craw because that happens to me on a weekly basis. Still, I can tell you story after story after story after something that I've read that's had a huge impact on my creative life, um,
Mm-hmm.
and my interest in new things and new ideas. And I'm super grateful for that because how else can you get that besides reading? I guess you could go out in the world and have a lot of experiences, but for me, reading has a powerful um, impact on me, how I move through space. And I had
Mhm.
that happen this
Mhm.
last weekend too. I read a book and just was like, what? How about you? I mean, did it infect your creative life or do it stimulate? Does reading stimulate anything for you?
Yeah, no, I think well, honestly, I see myself more at the beginning of where you are at now. I feel like all through
Ah,
school, I have been I've looked at reading as a chore,
ah,
and, like, have really read for pleasure because I just not since, like,
yep.
I don't know, middle school, just because I always have something that's assigned to me to read, and, like, once I'm done with that, I'm like, "Okay, now what am I doing? I wanna do something fun, and it's definitely not reading," right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so now, only recently I've started to read for fun on my own for the first time in, like, I don't know, a decade.
Nice.
Um, and so I feel like I'm definitely at the beginning of that journey. I just feel like I got burnt out on reading, and now I'm starting to just be like,
Yeah,
yeah, you don't have to read any fancy book. Like, just read whatever the fuck, like, what interests you is what you should be reading, right?
yep,
Um, and
yes.
like, it is interesting. Like, all of a sudden, I am having like I'm reading this book right now. It's called The Children's Bible, and it's this like apocalyptic
Mm,
story. About these like kids trying to survive in what is beginning to be clear is like the biblical apocalypse, but
yeah,
and so yeah, now I'm like, this is crazy. Like, this would be so cool if like you made like, I don't know, some sort of like children's version of this, like an actual children's book of this, like of
yeah.
these events or something like that. And then you're just like, you start spinning and the ideas start coming, but
Hmm.
like um it still is something where I'm just like, yeah, you should read for fun, and it still doesn't feel
Yes.
natural. I still like that's not the first thing I do when I like want to relax, but then I'm like, no, just like pick away at the book you're reading. But it's
Yeah.
still I feel like I'm in that school mindset of reading is such a chore and it takes up so much of my time,
Yeah.
and I don't want to be at all.
No, I think you're right. You're, I mean, you're not that far out of school, Ellie. It's not even a year yet.
No, mm-mm.
So
Yeah.
I get that. I get that. You'll, like you said, it sounds like you've already got pulled back in. Um,
Yeah.
and now you guess the thing.
Mhm.
Here's the thing. You can read at your own pace and whenever you want now. Nobody's making you do it.
No, it's beautiful. I read at such a
I've,
snail's pace. It's so slow.
well, how
Yeah.
slow would you say you read? Give me an example.
Oh, I don't know. On like in more dense books, I'd say I get through, I don't know, like 10 pages in like an hour maybe.
Ah,
Just
well,
snail's pace.
can I ask you a
But it
technical
works.
question then about reading?
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. Um, I mean, I know that this happens to a lot of people, but I think it's really unique to dyslexics. Like, I could read 10 pages and realize I haven't read them.
Yes.
Like, what just
I have that
happened?
all. Yeah.
I was like, wait a minute. What happened? I got to go back and
Yeah.
reread these because I don't know what happened.
I can totally zone out. I also have the experience of I don't read certain words if I don't understand them, and I'll go through the whole book and I couldn't actually tell you what the word is. I just like blank over it with my mind, and
Yeah.
it works, but I
Yeah.
don't know what the fuck what it meant.
Oh,
But
that's funny.
also, yeah, I can just like zone out and be totally two tracked. Like my brain is somewhere else, and I am reading, but nothing sticks. It all goes through
Yeah.
one end out the
I use that
yeah.
a little bit to, what you just described, I do to books sometimes. Like, I know immediately if I should read a book or not. Does that happen to you? Like, I'll crack it open and be like, yeah, this isn't going to work for me
Yeah.
right now.
I do that. I have I read half of so many books. I've probably read like the first half of more books than I've read like a whole book through. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, most of the time it's like I read the first page and I'm like, this is not happening. Like I
Yeah.
can't just make a book work. And my parents have like talked. They're always like, yeah, like you should read this book. Like it's really boring at first, but like you'll get into it. And I'm
Hmm.
just like, no, I won't.
Yeah.
Like it's not gonna. Yeah,
I know
yeah.
it's well, you're right. It is a chore. And I think
Mhm.
the only reason I read is I only reason I read and stick to a book is that if it has ideas that are exciting to me, like Moby Dick,
Mhm.
or I just read this book by I think you'd like this book actually. It's by a woman named Suleika. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. I think it's Juwad. She got a
Mm-hmm.
leukemia when she was graduated from college when she was 22, and she told
Mm-hmm.
this story. Um, and I just got sucked into it, right? Because it was like, wow, this is crazy, right? Because my mom died of leukemia, my brother died of esophageal cancer last year, right? And my sister has lymphoma. It's like so cancer. So I was interested in cancer,
Yeah.
right, and her experience, and I just consumed it. So I tend to read for things that are relevant to me at the time, and that keeps me going. But I'm with you. If it doesn't relate to me, if I'm not interested in it, I'm not going to read it because it's too much of a chore.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
spend time reading 10 pages that I didn't read and then have to reread them if I don't care about it.
Especially brutal. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
it's
I have
crazy.
that same experience of like I'm really choosy with my books. And
Yeah.
sometimes it doesn't make any sense. Like I'm like, this is actually really dense. I just read this book about this woman's experience with schizophrenia, and
Mm.
um it was incredibly dense. Like she's a very factual writer. Like this was my experience then, and then the next day I did this, and you're just like, this is dense, but it worked, and I don't
Oh,
know why, but it was her style of writing, and I was able to read through the whole thing, no problem.
yeah.
But it's
Well, that's
really
the interesting
interesting.
thing. Since reading is a fabrication, human beings have invented it. I think that's the
Mhm.
thing that's hard for people, right? Like when it comes to reading, like it's not fun for a lot of people,
Mhm.
right? Because it's
Mhm.
such a chore to do it. But it's
Yeah,
it is
it's a
invaluable. It's weird. It's like books are invaluable, but they're also I see them as a form of oppression too. Like it's this weird mix of like valuable and
yep.
torture and oppression. Like it's just fascinating to me. I mean, I see it. What's interesting is um I had one last question for you is that with my students don't read, which is crazy, and I get it, right? Like but to me, reading is I don't want to torture them, but so I just kind of give them short readings now. But I think reading is this invaluable portal into this other place. And it
Yeah.
could be dense, it could be light, it could be whatever. So I think it's a really an amazing thing reading, but it is. I think it's a weird rule. It's a set of rules that get enforced on people, which I just think is fascinating, right? Like it's just fascinating how the culture really sees it as this like one of the most important things. But I think that
Mhm.
the something we will talk in another episode is that I think dyslexics have because it's not dyslexia is not a reading disorder, it's something
Mhm.
else. I think that means that evolutionarily speaking, we're geared to do something important for the culture that's not connected to this rules and accounting, right? Like it's to provide something actually deeper, I think, and something that's
Mhm.
actually new to the culture to bring in. And I think dyslexics are good at introducing new things to people who aren't used to new things. Um,
Yeah.
I think that that's something
And
that'd be fun to talk about is the value of it.
yeah, for sure. I think if I don't know, I think it is really like one of dyslexics' main roles in society is to question the rules that
Hmm.
they grew up with, right? Because they don't work for them.
Yeah,
Um, they also
exactly,
don't work for a lot of other people for a lot of other different reasons, right? But
exactly,
I think it is, yeah, we're one of the groups of people that are meant to challenge the rules because that's the only way that society grows, and the only way that
exactly.
people evolve, right, is if those rules are bent and challenged. But
Yeah, or
um
modified, right? Yeah, bent and
yeah,
modified.
yeah,
No, it's
exactly.
it's fascinating. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
fascinating. Well, any last thoughts on reading before I know we have to kind of wrap it up early tonight. Any
Yeah.
last thoughts like about reading? Any books or any book
I
recommendations or books that
what is a book? I The Children's Bible. If you just want a
that
quick
sounds
side
the
read it. It's
children's Bible.
creepy. Yeah. Mhm. But
Well, you should read
um
this book that I just read. It's called Between Two Kingdoms by Suleika Juwad.
okay, we'll do.
Yeah. Two dyslexics sharing hot tips for books. All right, Ellie.
Exactly. All
I'm
right.
excited about our next episode. We'll have to think about what it's going to be.
Yeah.
All
There's
right.
so many more topics, but this has been great.
Exactly. Yep. All right. We'll talk soon, Ellie.
Talk to you later.
Yep. Ciao.